of them dismissing this. So Mike Johnson saying, I don't think that's appropriate about the possibility of a US intervention in Greenland militarily. And John Thune saying, I think that's probably getting the cart ahead of the horse. I don't see military action being an option there.
Here in the studio, we've got Mikey Smith from the Mirror, Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday, and of course Lara Spirit there in Washington. Kate?
Well, as I said earlier, I really think that if they go near Greenland militarily, that will be a whole new era we're entering. I mean, the pundit we just heard from earlier saying how can a NATO alliance works when you're waging that kind of war basically against one of them is just beyond me. So I just think that really would be a whole new world. Now, we heard Marco Rubio earlier. He was talking about maybe like buying it. But I do think that it is incredibly dangerous territory when you're talking about strong, powerful, militarily or economically countries scrambling for new sovereign, for new territory when there already is democratically elected sovereign governments. You know, no matter how close the ally, that is not something we could possibly excuse. You just have to hope, don't you, that a lot of this ends up being hot air and that where we come out at the end is some kind of deal on kind of military basis or whatever. But I don't know the details of what was already there, but it does strike me that this is just next level.
Mikey?
I suspect where we've gone wrong over the course of Trump being president of the United States is we very early on got hold of this idea that he was an isolationist, when in fact what he is an expansionist imperialist, and he's always wanted to get his hands on Greenland. I would be amazed if by 2028 he doesn't have control of Greenland by hook or by crook, and what I think was being implied in the press conference earlier with Caroline Levitt is that it's going to be a situation where the United States is going to Denmark and saying, give us Greenland or else we'll take it. And I suspect it will end up being the former, but that's almost as bad as an invasion. This is how Trump has gone about international diplomacy throughout his second term anyway, is, you know, all these wars he's stopped have been as a result of threats. You know, stop fighting or we will tariff you to oblivion. That's how he stops wars, I say with inverted commas. And I suspect it will be he wants to try and do exactly the same with Greenland. Do I think there'll be boots on the ground in Greenland? Probably not. Do I think Trump will be in control of Greenland by the end of his term? Almost certainly, yes.
If it's as explicit as give us Greenland or we're going to take it by force, that is absolutely tantamount to an invasion, with all the consequences that would flow with that you're describing. Okay, ruptures in the alliance, you know, enormous damage to the transatlantic relationship. But what are you thinking, Lara? Is the American position evolving here? I mean, Stephen Miller, just a day or so ago, was talking very tough about, you know, he didn't use the phrase might is right, but that was the thrust of all of it. He did say that power is right, force is right, and what America wants, America must have. And then we get a different position from Marco Rubio, much more diplomatic, as you might have expected. How do you read this? Is this soft cop, hard cop, or is the position actually evolving under pressure? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that Stephen Miller's comments have been rightly interpreted as going further than many of the previous statements on Greenland. Now what you see from both Marco Rubio and Caroline Levitt today was an attempt to say, look, this is nothing new. Both of them said this. This is something that has been stated. They were arguing not just by this president, but by previous presidents as well, that acquiring Greenland would be in America's interests. But there was also the assertion from both of them, though later on in their responses, and I would say a bit more subtle, that the first option that Trump would like is a diplomatic solution to this. And that's what Marco Rubio was saying when he was saying he'd meet with Denmark to discuss the situation next week. He said, as a diplomat, which is what I am now and what we work on, we always prefer to settle it in different ways, referring there to military means, wanting to settle it in a non-military way. Caroline Levitt saying they were actively discussing the purchase of Greenland, saying it wasn't a new idea, but saying even though all options remained on the table, the first option option has always been diplomacy. And of course, that is something that they were saying applied to Venezuela. Well, what we saw in the end was not a diplomatic conclusion to that question. But even so, I think you're right to suggest that there's been a slight change of tone today when it comes to this question of Greenland. And Rubio, speaking after that briefing to senators about Venezuela, was clearly keen not to talk that explicitly about Greenland. He was trying to say he didn't necessarily want to direct that and wanted to move on to speaking about something else. And that was his answer. So they are wanting not necessarily to make this something that is no longer in the news. But Levitt said that today in the press conference that, Trump and she had read the papers and read the coverage of this, and they wanted to be quite plain that this was not a new original idea, but something they've spoken about for some time. But I should say, in the first Trump term, and you'll remember this very well, John, Trump did muse about Greenland to his aides, and they didn't take him seriously and didn't think that it was something that he actually wanted to do or that they would really action. The difference now, of course, is that he's surrounded by aides, including, Stephen Miller, who is very, very keen on making sure that what the president wants is something that they're going to enact. So I think really worth watching and not dismissing, even though we're seeing perhaps a slightly more softer tone today.
Lara, let me come back to you. I mean, especially so in recent days, I've been seeing President Trump described as having an imperial agenda. It's now become common currency in talk about American politics. Some more sympathetically talk about him being a president who gets things done and doesn't hang about. He doesn't let arguments and rules get in his way when he's pursuing what he sees as American interests. And I've also seen him described less flatteringly as a gangster. Tell me how this argument is playing out there where you are in Washington, D.C., because it's not as simple now, I think, is it, Lara, as Democrats and those on the progressive side of America versus the Maga crowd. There are grey areas here.
Yes, I mean, something I will say is that we saw recently on CNN an overwhelming number of Republican voters in support of the president's actions in Venezuela. You've seen plenty of reporting, of course, which asked the question about how the notion of avoiding foreign intervention and putting America first. This is a case made by Marjorie Taylor Greene, until semi-recently an ally of President Trump, and now herself no longer even a congresswoman following that spectacular falling out with the president, making that case that how on earth could intervention overseas be in keeping with the message that President Trump has championed in advance and indeed in some cases since his election in November 2024. At this point, like I say, many Republicans in support, and indeed those who are kind of raising questions about it are more of those who have been critical of the Trump administration before. So those like Don Bacon, for example, retiring Republican congressman from Nebraska, who on the case of Greenland has been very critical of the intervention by Stephen Miller. But I will say on the question of Greenland, two extremely notable and senior voices who have questions about this are Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House and a very close ally of President Trump, even on some of those more controversial aspects of the second administration, and John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, his counterpart in, of course, the other chamber, both of them dismissing this. So Mike Johnson saying, I don't think that's appropriate about the possibility of a US intervention in Greenland militarily. And John Thune saying, I think that's probably getting the cart ahead of the horse. I don't see military action being an option there. Now, those are significant interventions around all of the noise on this Greenland question. It's definitely not clear that there is an overwhelming majority of GOP lawmakers who would be on Trump's side on this issue. Yeah,
those are the examples that really leapt out for me. Kate?
Is Donald Trump imperial? Gosh, I don't know. It's like a kind of undergraduate history essay. So what I would say is I think it's certainly true, isn't it, that Donald Trump is probably the most kind of personally powerful president we've had for some time. So one whose aides and people around him see it as their role to further his specific individual agenda rather than and Trump being kind of more powerful than the Republican Party. We talk about Trump rather than the Republicans, right? We don't often talk about Keir and not Labour. So I think certainly he's asserting himself as potentially, not a uniquely powerful US president, but one whose personal popularity, charisma, authority plays much more than the party that he's meant to be representing. And remember when he came in, he's an outsider the Republican Party. This is not he's almost remolded the party in his image with this MAGA base. So I suppose the difference between him and most kind of emperors is that he is democratically elected. He does still have his support, I think, of his voters. So I don't know if I would quite call him imperial yet, but I think that's like a fair thing to kick about, this idea that he's more individually powerful, and so therefore his individual whims, his individual say-so counts for much more than previous presidents we've seen recently.
Sure, and Lara, this open ambition for hemispherical dominance, the west of the world is ours. This is not something we've heard from an American president. The original Monroe Doctrine, which goes back to 1823. That was at the time of the British Empire, and this is our bit, not your bit. That was a very, very different context. And now we've got this assertion of dominance of the west of the world, the use of tariffs, not as a trade instrument, but as tariffs used the way that empires used to use gunboats. And we've got, meanwhile, at the very same time, we got today the news of Venezuela agreeing. I don't suppose, especially smilingly, and we may not care whether the Venezuelan regime smiles or not, but handing over 50 million barrels of oil, that's the kind of tribute that used to be paid to imperial courts.
It's yeah, I mean, you are right. And indeed, we obviously heard about this question of hemispheric dominance. And like you say, the now Donroe Doctrine, not the Monroe Doctrine, as Donald Trump calls it, that was explained, this idea of America first, including the Western Hemisphere, when we had that publication of the US security strategy semi-recently before the end of last year, when the big alarm bells started to ring for Europe, and they really started to ask questions about whether or not they could take the United States at its word and guarantee its support in the way that it had done under previous administrations. We had a post on Truth Social, where else, from the president this morning, criticizing the NATO alliance and saying, I doubt NATO would be there for us if we really needed them. He did, however, say we will always be there for NATO, even if they won't be there for us.
Yes.
Now, how a diplomat manages to pass that in a European capital, I'm not sure. It is a complicated and slightly, in some ways, confusing assertion of what the US position is in that respect. But even so, I think it definitely will make some concerned about where the US's loyalties lie and whether or not they can still count on them. And I think for many, many people, especially in European capitals, that answer has already come, and they think that actually they're going to have to build up capabilities on their own and try and work out a situation where in the years ahead they may not have to rely on US support as much as they do now.
Yeah, that Truth Social posting from the president will always be there for NATO, even if they won't be there for us. It somehow managed to combine reassurance with an insult.
I mean, not least because the only time Article 5's ever been invoked was after 9/11. I think two things. I think, one, everything is America first if America owns everything. And the other thing is, I wanted to pick up on something Trump said in his marathon speech to Republican leaders yesterday, which didn't really get a lot of focus because everyone was paying attention to other things, which was that he floated again the idea of cancelling elections. He had there was a little aside where he was like, oh, if I cancel elections, and then he said, oh, I can't talk about cancelling elections because then everyone will call me a dictator. Yeah, people will. But it's not the first time he's talked about it. The hill I will die on is that the 2028 election won't happen, won't take place. I think it will be cancelled. I think he'll find a pretext. And that's how we'll avoid having to do anything like January 6th again.
I must ask Lara about this. We've only got a couple of minutes. Lara, is that the case? Did the president throw in a possibility of cancelling the next general election?
Yeah, I mean, like Mikey says, there was a huge amount in that yesterday, and the aspect of that address that has got the most attention was this question, or this pleading with Republicans to be flexible on this issue of abortion in the healthcare proposals, which is becoming pretty controversial. Republicans, of course, still haven't provided their alternative to those expiring Obamacare-era credits, but there are some Republicans, anti-abortion Republicans, who are keen to make sure that there is no provision whatsoever that would allow any federal funds in any way to be used towards abortions. And Trump, having clearly made up his mind that he wanted these lawmakers to be a bit more flexible on that case. That's something that Levitt was asked about today, and it's definitely a big issue. And indeed, I think Trump really keen yesterday. You heard him to make sure that they focus on issues that they think that they have a kind of winning front foot on, things like immigration, for example, culture war questions around transgender athletes in sports. Like these are things that Trump really wants people to go at in the midterms, and it's certainly something that people inside the White House will be starting to really think about seriously, given we're not that far away from them now.
He also, by the way, pretended not to realise that he's not allowed to stand for a third term. But however, Donald Trump, it is a rock and roll roller coaster.